Hey folks, October is here, which means the spooky season is in full swing. What are your plans for Halloween? Are you attending a haunted house, dressing up as your favorite movie villain, or simply relaxing watching a horror flick? Do let me know in the comments below while I share with you some real horrors that happened on the night of Halloween. I hope you will enjoy it. So, let's get the party rolling. On Halloween night in 1957, hairstylist Peter Fabiano and his wife Betty were woken up in their LA home by a knock at the door. Thinking it was a late trick-or-treater, Peter brought some sweets ready to give them. When he opened the door, Peter was greeted by a woman wearing a mask who raised a hand wrapped in a paper bag and shot him in the chest, killing him instantly. By the time Betty made it to the porch, the shooter was gone. The investigation into Peter's murder was perplexing. There were no apparent motives, no stolen valuables, and no clues left behind. Though initially suspected to be a gang hit, Peter had no known criminal connections. Betty, in her statement to the police, mentioned only one name when asked about enemies: Joan Rabel. Joan, a writer and photographer from Philadelphia, had entered the Fabianos' life seeking employment at Peter's salon after her divorce. She and Betty developed a close friendship, eventually becoming roommates when Betty sought refuge during a rocky patch in her marriage to Peter. This relationship raised eyebrows in the conservative 1950s. As Betty reconciled with Peter, Joan's resentment grew. She confided in a new friend, Goldyne Pizer, about her desire for revenge against Peter. Joan successfully manipulated Goldyne into committing the murder on Halloween night. Goldyne purchased a gun, waited outside the Fabianos' home, and carried out the heinous act, subsequently disposing the weapon. Detectives eventually traced the murder weapon to Goldyne, leading to her arrest. Both women faced extensive psychiatric evaluations, as the court considered the impact of their homosexuality on the case. Goldyne confessed, believing she had saved her friend Joan from an evil person. Joan, on the other hand, remained mostly silent and enigmatic during the trial. Ultimately, both women changed their pleas to guilty, and they were sentenced to 5 years to life in prison for second-degree murder. Goldyne Pizer was released and remained in Los Angeles until her death in 1998. Details about Joan Rabel's life after prison are scarce, but it is presumed that she was released around the same time as Goldyne. The Fabiano family business was sold, and Betty Fabiano passed away in 1999 in Palm Desert, California. Whether she had any involvement in her husband's murder remains unknown. On October 31st, 1959, Californian dentist William V. Shine decided to play a mean, practical joke. He handed out 450 candy-coated laxatives to unsuspecting trick-or-treaters who were unlucky enough to knock on his door. No one seems to know why he did it, but 30 kids got pretty sick and one suffered irreparable harm. Authorities were able to narrow the cause of the illnesses and track the laxatives back to Shine. He was charged with multiple crimes, including outrage of public decency and unlawful dispensing of drugs. He never gave a reason for handing out the laxatives. Did your parents ever tell you to check your candies before eating it? While the vast majority of Halloween scare stories about razor blades and apples or poisoned candy are either urban legends or moral panics, one story is unfortunately completely true. On October 31st, 1974, 8-year-old Timothy had a packet of pixie sticks given to him by his father, Ronald O'Brien, to cap off his trick-or-treating. Within moments, Timothy was vomiting, and he perished less than an hour later. After changing his story multiple times, police learned that Ronald was responsible for his son's death as he had laced the candy with cyanide. Police found that the other children had also been given candy by Ronald, but they hadn't eaten it. Turns out, Ronald was in serious debt and had taken out a life insurance policy on his children. Ronald, or the Candyman as he was called, was found guilty of murder and executed in 1984. During the execution, a crowd of 300 demonstrators gathered outside the prison cheering, while some yelled, "Trick or treat!" Others showered anti-death penalty demonstrators with candy. On October 30th, 1975, 15-year-old Martha Moxley had accompanied some of her friends for a spree of Halloween pranks. When Martha failed to return home that evening, a frantic search began for her. The entire neighborhood joined the search, hoping that some accident had kept her away from home, but fearing the worst. But nobody saw Martha alive, ever again. The next day on Halloween, a friend of Martha discovered her body under a tree near the family's backyard. The sudden death of the teenager stunned the neighbors, and everyone believed that someone outside of the community had committed the murder. The investigators believed that the murderer belonged to the wealthy, gated community of Belhaven where the Moxley family lived. However, proving this, the police would encounter a world of privilege and wealth, a world which would go to extraordinary lengths to protect one of its own. And in the background loomed one of the most powerful dynasties in the United States, the Kennedys. Martha had been struck multiple times by a golf club, causing severe injuries to her head. The golf club head belonged to the Skakel family, who lived across the street from the Moxley house. The Skakel family had powerful connections with the Kennedy family and held a lot of influence. Martha was last seen hanging out with Thomas Skakel, her neighbor and a nephew of Ethel Skakel Kennedy. The case had remained unsolved for 25 long years. Finally, it was Thomas's younger brother Michael, who was tried and convicted in 2000 for Martha's murder. Reports had begun to circulate that while he was attending a reform school back in 1978, Michael had confessed to killing Martha. Gregory Coleman was one student who alleged Michael confessed to him saying, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy." This led to a one-person grand jury in 1998 by State's Attorney Jonathan Benedict, resulting in Michael's indictment for Martha's murder. On August 30th, 2002, Michael Skakel was sentenced to 20 years to life for killing Martha Moxley. He was 41 years old. On September 27th, 2010, Skakel's legal team filed a new appeal that argued his trial attorney, Mickey Sherman, failed to provide a competent defense. His new attorney, Hubert Santos, argued Sherman should have called witness Dennis Osorio, who could verify Michael was at his cousin Jimmy Terrian's house at the time investigators believed Martha was murdered. Michael served 10 years in prison, then in 2013 was granted a new trial based on a judge's finding that his original defense attorney had not adequately represented him. On October 30th, 2020, 45 years to the day since Martha was last seen alive, the state announced it would not retry Michael and declared him a free man. This would go on to become the most talked about murder of the 70s, a case which remains officially unsolved. One of the problems with prison is you have a lot of time to sit around and think, and since there are many twisted people behind bars, the stuff they think about is often messed up. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were both career criminals when they met in jail in 1978. By the time they were released a year later, they had come up with a sick plan. Working together, they would kidnap, torture, and kill several teenage girls. They converted a van into a mobile murder machine and began driving around looking for victims. Within 2 months, they killed 5 girls, and the last, 16-year-old Lynette Ledford, died on Halloween 1979. The sadistic killers recorded her cries and pleas for mercy, clearly enjoying it. When she was finally dead, they dumped her on a suburban lawn to see how the media would react. But Norris couldn't help bragging about their killing spree, and one person, he told, went to the cops. Both men were arrested. Norris cooperated with the police and claimed it was Bittaker who did all the killing. At their trial, the tape they made of Ledford begging for her life was played to the jury. Bittaker got the death penalty, though he died of natural causes before his sentence was carried out. For squealing on his accomplice, Norris received life in prison with a possibility of parole after 30 years that never happened. Norris died in 2020. Ronald Sisman was a 39-year-old photographer who lived in the Chelsea section of Manhattan. He was a rather prolific lensman who operated 2 photography businesses out of his house. On Halloween night in 1981, Ron was with his girlfriend, 20-year-old Elizabeth Platzman, when they were attacked at his home. Ron and Elizabeth were brutally beaten and then shot in the back of their heads. Their house had been ransacked, and a .25 caliber handgun that was registered to Ron appeared to be missing. The police speculated that the attacker might have known Ron since there were no signs of forced entry. Ron had also applied for 2 gun permits because someone had broken into his apartment before, and he feared for his safety. The initial investigation leaned towards the possibility that the intruders might have been looking for drugs, because the house was turned over and the furniture was torn apart. In the previous year, Melanie Haller, an actress, had accused Ron of attempting to force her to take drugs. But the charges against Ron were dropped eventually because Melanie didn't cooperate with the authorities. But they discerned that those 2 cases were not connected. The investigation hit a dead end beyond that. Later on, a prison informant claimed to the police that David Berkowitz, the infamous son of Sam, had told him about the murder before it happened. David allegedly mentioned that this was going to be carried out by the satanic cult that he was a part of. It was alleged that the murder of Stacy Moskowitz, son of Sam's last victim, was captured on film and that Ron Sisman was the one recording the murder from a distance. He mentioned that Ron and his girlfriend were murdered by the cult and ransacked the house because they were looking for a snuff film. At the time, there was no concrete proof that backed up these theories and claims, and as a result, the murders of Ron Sisman and Elizabeth Platzman remain unsolved to this day. Marvin Branland and his wife Ethel had spent Saturday evening, October 30th, 1982, handing out candy to trick-or-treaters when another person knocked on their door. Someone wearing a pillowcase with holes cut out for eyes stood outside. "Trick or treat, give me your money or I'll shoot," the trick-or-treater said. Ethel playfully tried to lift the pillowcase, thinking it might be a relative playing a joke. After all, their granddaughter Teresa had left the house just minutes before. But the trick-or-treater held it down. When Ethel turned around and started for the candy, the hooded trick-or-treater followed her inside, then pulled out a gun. He ordered the couple to the basement where they kept a safe. Marvin Branland was not a wealthy man, though he and his wife did have a safe in the basement. Few knew it existed, mainly just family members. When they got to the kitchen, Marvin reached for the gun. The trick-or-treater shot him in the throat. The shooter then tore off the pillowcase and threw it down before fleeing. But even with DNA in the mask and a family member bragging that he did it, no one was ever arrested for the murder. Hattori and his homestay brother Webb Haymaker received an invitation to a Halloween party on October 17, 1992, organized for Japanese exchange students. Hattori went dressed in a white tuxedo in imitation of John Travolta's character in the film Saturday Night Fever. At about 8 p.m., Haymaker and Hattori drove to the neighborhood in East Baton Rouge Parish where the party was being held. The two youths mistook the residence of Rodney Pears, a 30-year-old supermarket butcher, and his wife, Bonnie Pears, for their intended destination due to the similarity of the address and the Halloween decorations on the outside of the house. The correct address of the party was 10131, but they knocked on 10311 instead. What an eerie coincidence that the first 4 digits of the wrong address matched the date of Halloween. Hattori and Haymaker walked to the house's front door and rang the doorbell. Nobody came to the front door, but Bonnie Pears opened the side door leading to the carport and saw Haymaker standing a few yards away. Haymaker was wearing a neck brace due to a recent injury and bandages as part of a Halloween costume. He attempted to address Bonnie Pears, but she later testified that she panicked when Hattori appeared from around the corner and moved briskly towards her. She slammed the door and told her husband Rodney to get his gun. Outside, Haymaker inferred that he and Hattori had come to the wrong house. They were preparing to return to their car when Rodney Pears opened the carport door, armed with a .44 Magnum revolver. Hattori stepped back towards Pears, saying, "We're here for the party." Pears pointed the gun at him and yelled, "Freeze!" Haymaker had caught sight of the firearm and shouted a warning after Hattori, but Hattori had limited English and was not wearing his contact lenses that evening. It is possible that he did not understand Pears' command to freeze and did not see the weapon, or might even have thought that this was part of a Halloween prank. Hattori was also holding a camera which Pears mistook for a weapon. When Hattori continued moving towards Pears, Pears fired his gun at him from a distance of about 5 feet away, hitting him in the chest, and then retreated back inside the house. Haymaker ran to the home next door for help, returning with a neighbor to find Hattori badly wounded and lying on his back. The Pearses did not come out of their house until the police arrived about 40 minutes after the shooting. Bonnie Pears shouted to a neighbor to go away when the neighbor called for help. The shot pierced the upper and lower lobes of Hattori's left lung and exited through the area of the 7th rib. He died in an ambulance minutes later from blood loss. Charged with manslaughter, Pears evoked Castle Doctrine, by which Americans are permitted to apply lethal means to defend their homes. The jury found him not guilty. Speaking to Japan Today in 2012, Hattori's father said, "Sometimes I feel like he's still in America. Someday he'll come back home, I say to myself." Okay folks, I will be ending the first part of the video here today, but I will be back with more stories in part 2. Don't miss, and thanks for watching.